In January 2026, in a corner of the Detroit Auto Show usually reserved for concept cars and electric pickups, the U.S. Army parked something that did not belong there. A display model of a tank, low, angular, with a turret that had no obvious place for a human being inside it. The sign next to it read M1E3. Photographers pressed against the rope line because for months the only images circulating online had been unofficial ones. A blurry LinkedIn post here, a grainy long lens photo there. This was the first time the Army let the public get close. Here is what makes that moment strange. The Army had promised itself a next-generation tank before, and it had failed spectacularly. In 2009, after 9 years and $18 billion, the Pentagon canceled the most ambitious armor program in its history without fielding a single vehicle. The lesson at the time seemed final. Don't try to reinvent the tank. Upgrade what you have. And yet, here was a prototype delivered to soldiers in December 2025, built around ideas that trace directly back to that canceled program. Delivered 7 years ahead of the original schedule, already being pushed toward frontline trials by autumn 2026. So the question worth asking is not what the M1E3 looks like. It's how a program this ambitious moved this fast, when the last one just like it burned through billions and produced nothing you could put a soldier inside. The answer starts with a gun nobody remembers, built for a tank that never existed. Rewind to 1999. The U.S. Army had just watched its heavy armor struggle to deploy fast enough for the kind of wars it expected to fight next. The answer it settled on was Future Combat Systems, a program so large it aimed to replace not one vehicle, but an entire family of them. 8 manned ground vehicles, along with drones, sensors, and robotic systems, all tied together on a single wireless network. Boeing and Science Applications International Corporation coordinated more than 500 contractors across 41 states to build it. Buried inside that program was a vehicle called the XM-1202 Mounted Combat System, a 27-ton armored vehicle meant to deliver the firepower of a 60-ton main battle tank at less than half the weight. To do that, the Army needed a gun that didn't yet exist. Engineers at Binet Laboratories, the Army's artillery design facility at Watervliet Arsenal in upstate New York, built it, the XM360. A 120mm smoothbore cannon that weighed under 4,400 pounds, roughly half the weight of the M256 gun mounted on the Abrams. They shaved the weight off using titanium, high-strength steel, and carbon fiber composites, and fitted it with a muzzle brake that bled off recoil pressure before it even reached the crew. Paired with it was a new class of ammunition, the mid-range munition, a guided round that could arc over terrain and strike targets beyond the gunner's direct line of sight. The XM360 wasn't just lighter. It was engineered to keep its recoil impulse under 5,300 pound-seconds and its recoil length to 25 inches. Numbers that mattered because a lighter vehicle can absorb the same violent kick as a 70-ton Abrams without the whole platform becoming unstable. Solve the recoil problem and you solve the weight problem. That's the equation the Army spent years and hundreds of millions of dollars working out. None of it saved the program. Future Combat Systems collapsed under its own complexity. Requirements kept shifting. Cost estimates kept climbing. On the 23rd of June, 2009, the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition canceled the vehicle program outright. Every requirement scrapped. Not one mounted combat system reached a unit. It wasn't the only piece of shelved hardware gathering dust in an Army warehouse. Back in 1996, engineers had already built a working tank autoloader called the Megget, capable of holding 34 ready rounds and feeding the gun at 10 to 12 rounds a minute. It worked. The Army simply never put it in a fielded tank because there was no program asking for one. That's the pattern worth holding on to here. The Army wasn't short of ideas. It was short of a reason urgent enough to use them. For over a decade, the XM360 sat as a footnote, a very expensive lesson in what happens when the Army tries to leap instead of climb. 13 years after that cancellation, General Dynamics Land Systems stood a vehicle up at the 2022 Association of the United States Army Conference and called it AbramsX. It was not a tank the Army had ordered. It was a pitch, a technology demonstrator built to show what could be salvaged from a decade of shelved research and grafted onto a hull the Army already trusted. The resemblance to the dead FCS program was not subtle. AbramsX carried a version of the XM360, still lighter and lower recoil than the standard Abrams cannon, feeding an unmanned turret through an autoloader. Crew size dropped from 4 to 3 with everyone seated in the hull rather than exposed inside the turret ring. A Kongsberg Protector RS-6 remote weapon station, a 30mm autocannon built in Norway, sat on the roof for secondary targets. And underneath it all, a hybrid electric power pack from Cummins that cut fuel consumption by half against the standard M1 A2, while giving the tank something no Abrams variant had ever managed: the ability to sit silent, engine off, running purely on battery power, listening rather than being heard. The gun itself was designed to fire more than the standard armor-piercing round. Advanced multi-purpose ammunition capable of switching function against infantry, light vehicles, or fortifications with a single shell. Advanced kinetic energy rounds for the next generation of enemy armor. And the mid-range munition concept from the old FCS program, resurrected almost unchanged, still promising a shot that arcs over a ridgeline and finds a target the gunner never saw. Around all of it, General Dynamics wrapped an AI-assisted sensor suite meant to flag long-range threats to the crew automatically and prioritize which one gets engaged first, plus manned, unmanned teaming links that would let AbramsX receive targeting data directly from a scout drone flying ahead of it. General Dynamics was careful with its language. AbramsX was described as a bridge, a node, a demonstrator, not a program of record. The company had learned, watching FCS die, not to promise the Army a finished tank before the Army asked for one. It didn't need to promise anything. Within a year, the Army came looking. This is usually where I tell you to hit subscribe, and I still will, but stick with me for one more minute first, because the next part of this story is the part that actually explains why any of this mattered enough to fund. Before General Dynamics had even finished touring AbramsX around defense conferences, the Army had already run its own internal study back in 2019 through the Army Science Board. The board's conclusion was blunt. The Abrams platform needed a fifth-generation redesign, estimated at $2.9 billion over 7 years. Nobody acted on it immediately. Then, on the other side of the world, a war started answering the question for them. In January 2023, the United States agreed to send Ukraine 31 M1A1 Abrams tanks, $10 million apiece, billed at the time as a platform that could help Ukrainian forces punch through Russian lines the way it once punched through Iraqi ones. It didn't work out that way. By April 2024, 5 of the 31 had already been destroyed, several in a single 12-day stretch, and U.S. officials confirmed Ukraine had quietly pulled the survivors off the front line. The problem wasn't armor thickness or gun caliber. It was that a 67-ton tank running a fuel-hungry gas turbine engine is extremely difficult to hide from a drone operator with a $1,000 quadcopter and a pair of binoculars. There simply isn't open ground left on that battlefield that a tank can cross without being seen. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan would later call the Abrams simply not useful in that environment. By the end of 2025, roughly 87% of the original U.S. supplied batch had been destroyed, captured, or abandoned, even as Australia delivered a further 49 Abrams into the same drone-saturated fight. What survives now works as Ukrainian crews describe it, a mobile pillbox, moved at night or under jamming cover, with infantry screening it from the drones its own gas turbine engine practically advertises. This wasn't a uniquely American problem either. Russia's own tank losses in this war run into the thousands, and the majority of them trace back to the same cause: drones cheap enough to be treated as disposable, hunting vehicles worth millions. Whichever side wears the uniform, the arithmetic is identical, and it's the arithmetic the M1 E3 program is ultimately trying to rewrite. We covered the same pattern with the Challenger 2 in an earlier video, the story of Western heavy armor surviving direct hits through Chobham composite armor, then getting reduced to a supporting role because the battlefield stopped rewarding 30-ton steel boxes that move slowly and burn a lot of fuel doing it. The Abrams learned that lesson at a cost of $10 million a tank. Back in Washington, the Army drew the obvious conclusion faster than it usually draws any conclusion. On the 6th of September 2023, it canceled its planned M1A2 SEP V4 upgrade, the incremental path that had defined Abrams' modernization for 2 decades, and announced a full redesign instead. Major General Glenn Dean, the Army's program executive officer for ground combat systems, put it plainly. The tank, he said, could no longer grow its capabilities without adding weight. The Army needed to cut its logistical footprint instead of expanding it. The redesign got a name, M1 E3. Here's where the AbramsX demonstrator stopped being a trade show curiosity and started being a template. The M1 E3 keeps the Abrams hull and the proven 120mm gun family, but almost everything built around them changes. Crew drops to 3, seated together in the front of the hull rather than split between hull and turret. The turret itself goes unmanned, fed by an autoloader, protected by blowout panels engineered to vent any ammunition detonation up and away from the crew compartment rather than through it. A hybrid powertrain, pairing a Caterpillar internal combustion engine with a SAPA Act 1075 transmission rated for vehicles between 55 and 70 tons, targets a combat weight around 60 tons, roughly 10 tons lighter than the current M1A2 SEP V3. The sensor package tells you how far the thinking has moved since AbramsX, where the 2022 demonstrator carried a Kongsberg-built 30mm autocannon. The actual M1 E3 prototype shown at Detroit mounts an EOS R400 Mark II remote weapon station instead, configurable with a 40mm automatic grenade launcher, a 7.62mm machine gun, or a Javelin anti-tank missile, and cross-linked to an Echo Guard radar built specifically to detect and track drones across a full 360 degrees. A network of external cameras replaces the traditional periscope entirely, letting the crew fight with every hatch closed and still see the battlefield around them in every direction. The whole vehicle is meant to run on what the Army calls a digital backbone, a cloud link sharing targeting data across the formation in real time. At the Detroit unveiling, officials even floated the idea of an ordinary video game controller as the interface for operating some of the tank's remote systems, which tells you something about which generation of recruit the Army is now designing for. The schedule is the genuinely strange part. Under the original plan, the Army expected a first prototype sometime around 2032. General Dynamics Land Systems delivered one in early December 2025. 3 more prototypes are due through 2026, and the Congressional Research Service reports that soldiers from the 1st Cavalry Division at Fort Hood are set to begin evaluating early units this autumn, potentially receiving a full platoon by the end of the year. Full-scale testing is expected to run through late 2026, with a production decision targeted for 2027, contingent on how the prototypes actually perform. In its fiscal year 2027 budget request, the Army has already allocated $474 million to keep the program accelerating, part of a wider modernization push that also funds the XM-30 vehicle lined up to replace the Bradley. One of the soldiers who sat in the early crew station mock-up, already partway through leaving the Army when General Dynamics brought him in to help shape the design, put it this way to the program's manager: if he'd known he could work on a platform like this, he'd have stayed in. That's not a line from a recruitment advert. It's an actual quote from a man who've already decided to leave. It's worth sitting with what actually happened here because it isn't the story the Army usually tells about itself. Future Combat Systems is remembered correctly as one of the worst acquisition failures in modern U.S. military history. 9 years of work, 0 fielded vehicles, a program so unwieldy that it eventually collapsed under its own definition of success. But the XM360 cannon didn't disappear when the checks stopped clearing. Neither did the mid-range munition concept or the idea of an unmanned turret built around an autoloader instead of a human loader standing next to live ammunition. They sat in a technical archive for over a decade, waiting for someone to need them badly enough to dust them off. Russia had already built a production tank around that same unmanned turret logic. The T-14 Armata, unveiled in 2015, put its crew in an armored capsule in the hull and kept the turret empty, for exactly the same reason American engineers gave in 1999. A human being inside a turret is a human being sitting directly behind the ammunition. The M1E3 arrives at a similar answer a decade later, forced there not by Russian design philosophy, but by Russian drones burning through American tanks in a war nobody in 1999 could have described to you. America isn't even first through the door among its own allies. Germany's Rheinmetall has its Kf-51 Panther already in pre-series production for Hungary, built around the same unmanned turret autoloader and 360-degree camera formula, arguably a year or two ahead of where the M1E3 sits today. What used to be the single strangest idea in Western tank design, a turret with nobody inside it, is quietly becoming the default answer across NATO. Not because any one country copied another, but because they're all reading the same footage out of Ukraine. None of this guarantees the M1E3 works. A delivered prototype is not a fielded tank, and the compressed schedule that got soldiers into a crew station 7 years early is the same schedule that has to survive live fire testing, mud, heat, and whatever the Army finds broken once actual crews start driving it hard. Production timelines in defense procurement move. This one already has, more than once, and it will likely move again before the first M1E3 reaches a combat brigade. But somewhere on a test range near Fort Hood this autumn, there will be 3 soldiers sitting shoulder to shoulder in the front of a tank hull, looking at a wall of screens instead of a turret ring, driving a vehicle built from a gun that was supposed to have died in 2009 along with the rest of a program nobody wanted to talk about afterward. The Army spent $18 billion to learn how not to build a tank. It may have just spent a fraction of that figuring out it had already built the right pieces. It simply hadn't found the war that would make it use them.